we go. Well, this is a very special occasion with Marvin Kalb. Many of us on this call, some of us, were raised on Marvin Kalb. Marvin Kalb, you accompanied our parents in our intellectual development in the late 50s, early 60s, 70s. I should just put a marker here. It's now January 27th, 2025. And Sergei Nikolaevich shows a hand gesture, which I know what he means by that, which is Ukraine is our friend, and we are their friend. We know that. So much to say about you, and I'm going to try to limit this, Marvin. Let me explain to some of the people on the call. There's some new people. This Monday series, and you're always welcome. You're always welcome. Next Monday, we will have James Nixie of the Chatham House in London, who is a Russia-Eurasia specialist, as Marvin Kalb is. And so these Monday sessions, winter and spring, are an outgrowth of a course that was set up mainly for students in Ukraine after the full-scale invasion of February 22. But since then, others have joined and have enriched this process. Last fall, we had a formal course called International Crisis Management, and those who completed the course got certificates signed by Foreign Policy Research Institute and IRIS at George Washington, which is the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies. I'm just setting the context to mention that anybody who's new today, you're very welcome to continue with us. Next week for James Nixie, the following week, we'll have the former U.S. ambassador to Mexico. We see things happening in the news today with Colombia and the new administration. Talk about the administration later. Let me try to say in a couple of minutes what television was to people of my generation. We've had wonderful printed journals, newspapers since the 18th century in America. They've been very contentious at times between Adams and Jefferson. And I mean, there were really, really some very strong things, you could say antagonistic things in our early printed press. But we lived with printed press for 200 years. And then in the early mid 50s, this thing came along, television. And at the time, some of the people on this call will not remember. At the time, our parents thought of this as kind of like social media today. It's going to ruin your mind. You're just going to be watching captive video and Howdy Doody and stuff that will rot your mind. And of course, as children, we didn't listen to our parents. We loved Howdy Doody and kept, but then the three networks came with the best journalism, I think, that America has ever had. Marvin Kalb was central in this. He was hired by Edward R. Murrow, who's a great hero to many of us. It was Edward R. Murrow, if I remember correctly, who decided to not obey the orders of his boss at CBS, and he took on Joe McCarthy. And things that happened in television, whilst the Cronkite showed images of Vietnam, television in the second half of the 20th century was enormously influential, was enormously well-sourced. The three networks, and I should remind people, all we had was three networks. We didn't have 100. We didn't have wire and cable and social media. So the three networks, we have to remember the context here. This was it. This was all Americans watched the Kennedy funeral. And this was a uniting factor, something that sadly we don't have anymore. Marvin Kalb, I think, was hired by Edward R. Murrow. It was a great hero to Jack Zedkulik and me. He took a 90% pay cut when John Kennedy invited him to be the director of U.S. Information Agency. And we remember him as the best we ever had. Now, Marvin Kalb, you were central in this second half of the 20th century development of the best news feeds we've ever had. You were the Moscow correspondent for CBS. I think you worked for ABC at one point.
No,
No, but you worked for two networks, I thought. No,
CBS
just
and NBC.
NBC. Um, and your reportage from Moscow was unparalleled. I mean, very few of us really understood the importance of getting things accurate in Moscow, and you did that several times a week. You were central to our information during the Cold War and beyond. Um, I read your book when I was Peter the Great. It's a wonderful book. When Khrushchev first met you, he noticed that you're very tall, and he said, "You're tall like Peter the Great," and I think that became your nickname. Um, you've now published, soon to come out. It's not quite distributed yet. Another Russia, and I'm guessing the title of that book has to do with the Russia of the later part of the 20th century, which was more amenable to negotiating, to agreeing, to understanding the importance of mutually assured destruction. They were rivals. They did nasty things. Um, they did active measures and propaganda, but they were a country that was somewhat rational and predictable. Now we have a different kind of Russia, and I fear it's not a good one. Let me, before I forget, let me put up for everybody watching. This is the book about to be released. This is Marvin Kalb's latest book. It was due to come out in August, but he gives us good news. It may be coming out soon. Khrushchev and Kennedy. And this has to do, of course, with the Berlin crisis, I think, but to a greater extent, the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I remember that as a teenager. We thought we would die. Marvin Kalb, take us from there. Take us, your experience is so vast, I don't know where to begin, but let me welcome you to begin wherever you'd like. But you have to discuss this book and the night at the opera. You have to give us that story.
Okay, well, Dan, thank you very, very much, and good morning to all of you. And let me clear up one point on the new book, A Different Russia. The book is out and has been out now for several weeks. There's a mistake on Amazon today indicating that the book will not be available until August. That is not accurate. It is and has been available for the last couple of weeks. Excuse me. And as a matter of fact, the good news, at least for an author like me, is that Amazon indicated this morning that the book A Different Russia is the #1 book that is being sold today. That has to do with Russia. All other books, that's a separate category, but
Yes.
this is for the Russian. That's a good deal for me.
We don't value modesty, Marvin.
Yeah,
Thank
no,
you.
no,
Thank
no.
you.
I am very proud of that. You work, as I'm sure many of you know, you work terribly hard on a book. It's an accumulation of years, and in my case, decades of experience, and you try to put it all into a form that is interesting and informative, and you're telling a story. That was always the line that I got from Murrow, tell me a good story. And you try to do that in a book.
Yes.
I've done 17 books. 2 of those books were novels, which I enjoyed writing too. The last 3 books are part of a series that I've put out. And the first Stan has already made an allusion to, and that was the year that I was Peter the Great. That's the title of the first of 3 memoirs, the last 3 of my books. The second was called Assignment Russia. And the third here is A Different Russia. In the first book was a discussion of what it was like in Russia in 1956. And very quickly, That was the year that started in February with a speech by Nikita Khrushchev
Mhm.
called The Secret Speech, in which he had the courage to take on the legacy of Joseph Stalin and to point out to people in the Soviet Union, but communists all over the world, that Joseph Stalin was a murderer, a killer, a horrible organizer. And he said this at a time when Stalin's legacy, he died in 1953. This was 3 years later. His legacy was still very strong. And here was the new leader of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, saying that Stalin actually was a madman. People who heard that were in a state of shock, but in a couple of months, one began to see the effect of that speech on the people of the Soviet Union. The concept of fear was something that they lived with all the time. After that speech, very gradually, fear, like taking off a heavy coat, of fear began to be lifted from the backs of the Soviet people. They began to talk in ways they had not been able to talk before. Writers began to write things they'd never been able to write before. And there was a period of reform. Didn't last terribly long, but the period of the Khrushchev era is one that I spent 5.5 years in Moscow during that period from 1956 through 63, going back to the US for a year or two in between. The second book was Assignment Russia. That took me from 1957 to 1960, May, the summit meeting in Paris that never quite got off the ground because Khrushchev didn't want it to get off the ground. It followed the exposure of the U-2, the American spy plane flying over the Soviet Union. It was shot down. And of course, the pilot managed somehow to escape. And there was a trial in August of 1961. And that was also a big story and a big deal. This last book is really the summary, and it's taking much of what I had picked up in the Cold War era of the Soviet-American confrontation and try to put it together in a form that makes sense to readers today. And the title of the book, A Different Russia, requires a bit of a definition here. And Dan touched on it earlier. I mean a different Russia, different from today.
Right.
Putin's Russia is very distinct and, in my judgment, both consistent with the tradition of Russian history, with autocratic leaders one after another. But there were also periods of time in the more recent time, the period of Nikita Khrushchev's, quote, reform, picked up by Gorbachev in the 1980s into the 1990s, followed up by Yeltsin in the 1990s. And then even at the beginning of the Putin era, there was a continuation of a somewhat spirit of openness within Russian society. But by 2004, for a number of very distinct reasons, Putin switched very dramatically from an effort to be open to the world to one where he has been very close to the world. And we have a Russia today which is unfortunately in a period of absolute hostility toward the Western world, certainly toward the United States, regarding the US as an evil hegemon determined to destroy Russia. that is the image of the United States that he is pushing forth. And I wanted readers today to understand that that is not all of Russia, and that there are other times and other spirits that run through the history of Russia with a number of its leaders. And I was focusing in this book on the different Russia of Nikita Khrushchev. Now, let me be very clear at the start. Nikita Khrushchev was a devout communist, a fierce Russian nationalist, but he was also a communist who believed it was possible to negotiate with the West. And like Peter the Great, he, Nikita Khrushchev, reached out to the West and to try to get the beginning of a good relationship with the rest of the world. He remained a communist to the day he died. He wanted everybody to live like a Russian, but he was smart enough to understand that's a dream and you've got to live with the reality. And the reality was he wanted to bring the West into the Soviet Union. And so he invited countless number of scholars, athletes, musicians, diplomats to come to Russia and to deal with the Russian people, strike deals. Khrushchev had the illusion. This was one of the, I think, remarkable things about him. He had the illusion, a dream really, that if he could sit down with an American president for one day, just the two of them, nobody else, they would be able together to settle every problem in the world. Well, I mean, we think about how silly that was, but in his mind, he did have that idea. I call it naive. It was an idealistic dream that he lived with to the day he died. And in fact, when he learned that Kennedy in 1963 had been shot and killed, Khrushchev cried. Now, how do I know that? I know that from any number of sources, including his son, who lived in the United States for a long time and taught at Brown University. So my effort in this book is to talk about the Cold War, that period of time which many Americans tend to forget now, and I think many people forget now and shouldn't. Period of time when communism was at its highest point, the United States was at its highest point, and the two were on a collision course. And it ended with the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I want to get into that in just a moment. But it was larger than a specific crisis. It was a state of mind. And in that state of mind, if you were in the Soviet Union, you thought of the Western world, led by the United States, as an antagonistic enemy, but one that you had to deal with because both sides wanted to avoid the possibility of a nuclear war. And so the subtitle of this book is Khrushchev and Kennedy on a Collision Course. From the moment that Kennedy took over, January 20, 1961, Khrushchev wanted to have a summit with him. And he put out the word, and there were a lot of bumps along the way. But in early June of 1961, the two of them met in Vienna at a summit that started with the highest expectation of success, but ended 2 days later in a deep sense of depression, because both had come upon the reality of national interest as it would be defined by both leaders. Now, how would that then be manifest? What was interesting at the very end of the summit, Kennedy raised with Khrushchev the possibility that one or the other could miscalculate, and through miscalculation, lead the war, the entire world, toward a nuclear war. Khrushchev exploded in anger with about 5 minutes left of this summit, screamed at the top of his lungs, miscalculation, miscalculation. I'm sick and tired of that word. Stop using that word, miscalculation. What was on his mind was that he thought Kennedy thought Khrushchev would miscalculate. He was right. And Khrushchev thought Kennedy would miscalculate. He was wrong. The effect of that explosion about miscalculation was that Khrushchev screamed at Kennedy, "If you want war, then so be it."
Wow.
Kennedy did not immediately respond. There was a pregnant silence, after which he said, "Then, sir, it is going to be a very cold winter." Despite the fact that that was a realistic judgment on Kennedy's part, Khrushchev, in his head, believed, having now finally met Kennedy, with 3 words that Khrushchev used to describe Kennedy. 1, obvious, young. 2, sort of obvious, inexperienced. 3, not obvious, weak. Young, inexperienced, weak. I heard that over and over again from people who dealt with Khrushchev on a daily basis. And Khrushchev, thinking that Kennedy was weak, decided that he would try to take him to the cleaners and advance Soviet interests in that way. And what he did in August 13th, I believe, 1961, he built the Berlin Wall. That Berlin Wall stayed up until 1989, when it came down 2 years before the end of communism in the Soviet Union. That wall represented the division of East from West, West from East, and it defined the essence of the Cold War. What was fascinating at that time was that a colleague of mine, Dan Shore, who was based in Berlin, went into East Germany, and among the many other questions he asked was, supposing you put up that wall, supposing the United States had chosen to knock the wall down, what would Khrushchev have done? And the answer that Dan got was nothing. Khrushchev would have done nothing.
Mm-hmm.
When I heard that, I took that idea and began to play with it in conversation with Soviet officials. And I traveled to different parts of the Soviet Union that they allowed me to go to. I spoke to a lot of people, and I spoke about many different issues, but I always went back to the Berlin Wall. What would have happened, do you think, from your leader, Nikita Khrushchev? What do you think he'd have done if Kennedy decided to knock the wall down as it was being built? You think that would have led to war? Uniformly, the answer was no. Khrushchev would have accepted it. Reluctantly, but he'd have accepted it. But Kennedy did not knock down the wall, and Khrushchev felt that that was a sign of weakness, confirmation of his judgment of Kennedy at the summit, and he took into his head that he was then going to correct the strategic imbalance between the United States and the Soviet Union. Well, how do you do that? Words? No. He said in his colorful language, He's going to put a hedgehog in Uncle Sam's pants, which was his way of saying he's going to make life very uncomfortable for Uncle Sam. And what he took into his head was a plan which ended up with the Cuban Missile Crisis. In May of 1962, he unleashed a program that sent 50,000 Soviet troops, tens of thousands of Soviet missiles, rockets, Cuba. These were all going from different parts of the Soviet Union to 2 ports on the Black Sea, through the Dardanelles, across the Mediterranean, across the Atlantic Ocean. And month after month, this flow continued, and the United States knew nothing about it. That was the astonishing fact. In the Soviet Union at that time, until late August, when we began to sense and we were told in different ways that the Russians were providing help to Cuba, but the help was never defined. And Cuban exiles put the word out in the United States that that help was defined as troops and missiles, and some of them might even have nuclear warheads. And even then, Kennedy chose to define all of these weapons as defensive in nature. Now, why he did that was partly political. The Democrats were facing an unhappy situation in an upcoming election. Maybe it was that Kennedy simply misjudged it, and his intelligence people misjudged it. But it was a huge misjudgment. On October 22nd, 1962, Kennedy delivered one of the most important speeches of the 20th century. And he laid down a barrier across the northern part of Cuba, saying that anyone who would pierce this show of American military force would be repulsed, and if there were an attack on American forces, the United States would respond with a direct attack on the Soviet Union. And that began 1 week, if you were in Moscow at the time, that began a week of extraordinary tension that built day by day by day. And Dan wanted me to tell you specifically about one story, which I must say my wife and I have been disagreeing on for the last 60 some odd years.
We'll take your version, Marvin.
Okay. My version is that on that Tuesday, the day after the Kennedy speech, in Moscow at that time was, I'll think of his name, it's slipping my mind at the moment, but a great American opera star,
Right.
Jerome Hines.
Mm-hmm.
He spoke Russian, and he did Boris Godunov, the opera, in Russian, did the lead role Tuesday, the day after the crisis begins. He's in Moscow, and my wife has tickets to the opera. And then the argument is, did we actually go or not go? Whoever is right on that point, the key point was not whether I was at the opera. The key point was Nikita Khrushchev and 4 members of the Politburo and Mrs. Khrushchev showed up for the opera. In other words, we were in a collision. A world war was a step away, a decision away, and Khrushchev shows up to listen to an American opera star sing Boris Godunov. Now, That was, to me, any journalist, any human being could spot this as a huge indication, a signal that Khrushchev wanted somehow not to acknowledge his blunder on going into Cuba in the first place, but having made that blunder, how do I get out of it? And he was indicating strongly by his presence that through negotiation, we're going to work our way out of this. It was truly an extraordinary moment. And on Wednesday of that week, a British scholar did a long article for one of the British newspapers saying, let us have a summit meeting to try to work our way out of this dangerous mess. Khrushchev immediately said yes. Again, strong indication of his desire to talk his way out of this. Kennedy said no, not until you remove your missiles from Cuba. On Thursday, the UN Secretary General says, let's take 3 weeks to negotiate a way out of this crisis. Khrushchev says yes. Kennedy says no. Get your missiles out first. Friday and Saturday, one day, Khrushchev sends him a letter, almost a love letter, saying, let us both talk, let us meet, let us find a way out of this. And Kennedy says, no. On Saturday, Khrushchev sends it's as if the letter was written by a committee rather than by Khrushchev, very strongly worded letter saying, you get your missiles out of Turkey, pointing at us, and we may then consider getting our missiles out of Cuba, pointing at you. Kennedy thought that night, Saturday night, before the fateful Sunday, that if Khrushchev did not fold by Sunday, the 28th of October, on the 29th, he would have to take military action against him. Any military action at that point, US action against Russian people, troops in Cuba, would have led directly to attacks from the Soviet Union on the United States and the United States on the Soviet Union. And we would then have had the first use of nuclear weapons since the Americans dropped 2 atom bombs on Japan in August of 1940. Fortunately, on that Sunday, Khrushchev sent a letter, and that letter was made public in a 5 p.m. Moscow radio report, read, by the way, on the radio by Yuri Levitan. It's a name that probably will escape many of you, but Yuri Levitan had this fantastic voice and had been on Moscow radio for major Soviet announcements of war or peace. The minute I heard his voice, 5 o'clock Sunday, October 28th, I knew it was one of 2 things. Either he was announcing war, or he was announcing peace in some form. And in the second paragraph of that letter, the words, they're in the book, all of this stuff. The words, as I remember, the key phrases were crate the missiles, return them to the Soviet Union. And I screamed, he just caved. He just caved. He did what Kennedy demanded that he do. I cannot really tell you now because it's so difficult to duplicate the experience. But at that time, if you were engaged in politics, diplomacy, journalism, whatever it happened to be, but if you knew what was happening, and my sense is that the American people knew and the Russian people knew and everybody around the world knew, we were in a terrible, dangerous mess that could have been catastrophic in consequence. But Khrushchev had the guts, just as he had the guts to denounce Stalin in 1956. He had the guts in October of 62 to pull his missiles out of Cuba. In other words, publicly to acknowledge a mistake. Khrushchev was called a harebrained schemer by people in the Politburo who used that opportunity to go after Khrushchev. And in October of 1964, he was unceremoniously kicked out of power. But in the old Soviet Union, pre-Khrushchev, somebody kicked out of power would have been killed. There's no question about that. The system was cruel, bitterly cruel. Khrushchev managed to soften the edges of an ugly system so that when he was kicked out, he was not killed. He lived another 8 years, 9 years. He wrote a book that was a big seller in the Western world. It was his own memoir. He had a small dacha given to him outside of Moscow, a large apartment in Moscow. He had a car and a driver. His children were allowed to continue to work. His son, Sergei, was allowed to leave to go to the United States. In other words, the system had changed sufficiently that it became somewhat civilized in the manner in which it dealt with a leader and a former leader. And Gorbachev, many years later, described himself as a student of the Khrushchev era. And that allowed him to think about a more open Soviet Union. And in fact, Gorbachev's actions led to the end of the Soviet Union as a functioning communist society. Now, I could go on and be happy to in Q&A, but I'm looking at the clock too.
Well,
And I'd be happy to take any of your questions or anyone else who's been kind enough to listen.
Thank you, Marvin. Thank you so much. I have a dozen questions, but I encourage anybody here to unmute or post something in the chat. Now, there are a couple of details in your opera anecdote. I've heard you say in the past a few things you didn't mention today. First of all, you were reluctant to go. Your wife kind of bullied you, or whatever the word is. But more important,
I mean, wives do have power.
absolutely.
I've
And
been living with one.
which suddenly I think of Raisa Gorbachev, who was a real person of some influence. But more importantly, the short one-on-one conversation you had backstage with Khrushchev. Could you quote that?
Yes, no, absolutely. Because I had this odd relationship with Khrushchev in that I was so much taller than he and most Russians. He called me Peter the Great. And I had said to him way back in 1956 at a July 4th party that I was 3 centimeters shorter than Peter the Great. Khrushchev loved that story, bursts out laughing. Everybody else laughed. It's an interesting insight. Whenever a dictator laughs, everybody around him laughs, even if it's not funny. Khrushchev laughed, everybody laughed. So I was allowed to get around the security that was always with Khrushchev because Khrushchev would nod to the head of security. He's Peter the Great. It's okay. And so I was able to get past the guard, approached Khrushchev, and said to him something like roughly these words: are there good people around in the world today who can somehow resolve this crisis? He said, yes, there are. I said, could you please identify them? Could you tell us whether Khrushchev, I said with a smile, whether Khrushchev is one of them, whether Kennedy is one of them? Yes, there is a way out. If good people, he said, want a way out, we can find it. That was the first, to the best of my knowledge, that was the first comment by Khrushchev following the famous Kennedy speech that indicated that he heard Kennedy, and what he wanted to do was sort of acknowledge his blunder without going too far in the acknowledgement of the blunder, and see if they can talk their way out of the crisis. Kennedy's strength at that time was one, he knew that in a strategic balance, the United States was stronger. He also knew that in any exchange of nuclear weapons, whether you were stronger or weaker, you would lose. The number of people who would be killed would be catastrophic. And Khrushchev and Kennedy were both veterans of World War II. I think that was very important. They regarded war and the memory of war from a realistic personal perspective. This was not an academic exercise for either one. They both understood what war was.
Your description of the Vienna meeting in June of '61 reminds me of Reykjavik. There are some parallels, aren't there? The Reykjavik meeting in 1985, thank you, Volodya, began with a tone of enormous optimism and ended, everybody came out of that room dejected and depressed because this was, I don't think you covered that story, but I'm sure you're aware of it.
No,
Jack,
I was there at the time. I was
were you
yes.
with Jack Matlock? And
No, I know what it
well,
was.
tell us, am I right to think of this as a parallel to the Vienna meeting where great spirits going in and great disappointment coming
No,
out?
in that respect, they're absolutely right. But in one respect, no. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, both sides were aware we were one decision away from a nuclear war. In Reykjavik, it was a diplomatic summit. The two leaders were there. They were seeking an agreement if it was possible. They were both fascinated by the idea of serious cuts in the nuclear strength of both sides. And when you say about the expectation, yes, it was a big expectation, but both sides were well aware that words were cheap, and it was for someone like Reagan at that time. Reagan had a little bit like Khrushchev in a way. He had a dream that somehow, by the strength of his personality, the fact that he was president of the powerful United States, if he wanted to give up on nuclear weapons, the other side would give up immediately because it was weaker. But neither side was ready immediately to give up, and they had both carried themselves to a level of expectation that was unrealistic. And then when George Shultz came down for a press conference at that point and explained to us that President Reagan actually wanted cuts, significant cuts in nuclear weapons, that could be believed. but whether he wanted to eliminate whole systems of nuclear weapons, no. He couldn't buy it, and neither could Gorbachev.
Although intermediate range nuclear forces were a whole system, and a couple of years later, they did agree to eliminate INF. I don't know if this was just a fig leaf, but at that time, the Soviets said, you covered it, you were there, I was not. 1986, thank you, Volodya. The Soviet side said, well, we would agree on everything except for this crazy thing called Strategic Defense Initiative, Star Wars. Now, was that just a rhetorical fig leaf?
No. That was very real. That was one of these things that Reagan had in mind, and he thought that if you could have a system above it all that would make the danger below it all somehow neutered, that would be a magnificent thing. Sure, that would be a magnificent thing. And both sides are now far more advanced in the use of space for strategic military purposes. Right. But at that time, it was for Reagan a dream, and he would not give it up. He would not give it up. And even though Gorbachev, I think to humor him, I don't think Gorbachev agreed to anything at that time. But I thought to humor him, it meant nothing. Sure, let's talk about it. But that didn't mean that he's giving anything up.
Okay, because you said earlier that they went far beyond being realistic, and that both sides went beyond their comfort zone and got into talking about true elimination of nuclear weapons, and that they both looked over the precipice and really did not want that to happen. Did I understand that that's what you said earlier? That they part of the reason that Reykjavik did not work is that both sides, when it really came down to it, did not want to remove large numbers of nuclear weapons.
Not at that time.
Right. Okay. Now we have some good chats in the which we're going to turn to. Let me. We can call it larger picture. Vladimir Karamurza, recently released, has been saying very often that in Soviet and Russian history, when the changes occur, you never know when, but they occur within 3 days. And he refers to the October Revolution and February revolutions, and to the 1991, the fall of the Soviet. And I've been curious about your views of what he says. Is he a crazy optimist to think that he says that inevitably this will happen again? There will be an unexpected sudden change, and if we are prepared, then we can truly have a new Russia. Is this utopian thinking?
I don't think he's dreaming at all. I think he's right on. I think that Russian history is built for surprise. There are decades, dark decades that pass, so dark that people think that nothing could ever change. And then suddenly, overnight, bingo, there is some kind of explosion and things begin to happen. I have felt now for a couple of months that Putin himself is a short timer. I don't mean by that he's going to be kicked out of power tomorrow or next month or 6 months from now. I believe he's a short timer in the sense that Karamurza is talking about in Russian history. When a dictator, any kind of dictator, is the last person to know that he's in trouble, because the people around him who do know that he's in trouble are afraid to tell him he's in trouble. So the forces accumulate beneath this figure and they explode and he's kicked out of history. And I think that Putin is at that point right now. My strong feeling is that when you look at the elements, major elements taking place within Russian society, you begin to understand that there is a boiling dissatisfaction that could erupt at any time, although given the nature of modern dictatorships, because we learn things from the media under total Putin control, the image is one of stability, but it's not stable when 100,000 of your people have already been killed. That's an estimate. Who knows what the real number is?
Oh, it may be 10 times that much. It could be.
Who knows?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
the going number at the moment is 100,000 thereabouts. Now you tell me that wives and mothers and children have no knowledge that these people have died, and for what? And also the people who are around Putin know very well he's the one who thought this war could end in a week, that they could be in Kyiv in a week, they would put in a pro-Russian government, and that would be the end of Zelensky and the end of all of this nonsense about independence. Well, we're now starting our 4th year of this war. Somebody knows that. That was a humongous, to go back to Khrushchev's time, harebrained scheme, and it didn't work. And the Russian economy today is in a state of inflationary pressure. The bank doesn't have the money to loan. What? 40% of the Russian budget today is on military. 40%. They're on a war footing. 30% of the rest of the budget is on internal security. That is not a stable society. And an eruption could easily, not easily, but could.
Thank you. I want to turn to some of these wonderful chat questions. Let me just say the questions I will ask later, if there's time. First of all, I'd love to hear your comments on your own book, Enemy of the People. Many people in Washington, including me, are very alarmed at what's going on now. That's a future question. Second one, Timothy Snyder, Saturday at Davos, made some very interesting comments about the central role of Ukraine in European history. It's been the objective. He claims that Hitler's main objective was to take Ukrainian farmland, and likewise Stalin. Obviously, the Holodomor was an effort to control Ukraine. So those are future questions if we have time. And then I can't leave this conversation without asking. In fact, let me do this now. When I was a child, we were told that Khrushchev said, "We will bury you." And we understood that as a death threat. Now, I've always wondered, there's a French expression, je danserai sur ta tombe. And in Russian, it's something like, "Я буду танцевать на твою могиле." I'm going to dance on your tomb. Is that what he said? And was his expression magnified and exaggerated to turn into something we call the Red Terror? I mean, did we misunderstand Khrushchev? How murderous could he have been?
Dan, I am an old radio and television guy, and I keep looking at the clock. And the clock tells me we've got 3 minutes to go. And you've asked questions that will take 3 hours to respond to.
Oh, I thought you could give us 3 hours. Okay.
I'm afraid I can't.
Message received. Let's go in order. Here's Serhiy Mikolaichuk, a Ukrainian, who says, "Thank you for taking the time. Would you assess the role of modern media in military conflicts, particularly Russia, Ukraine? And in your opinion, what have been the most critical mistakes that the media have made in covering this conflict?" Thank you. Thank you, Serhiy.
We are dealing now, I think, with the American media, and I will start with that. The American media goes where American soldiers go. That's why when there are American soldiers in Vietnam, There's American media in Vietnam, and it is a major story. Ukraine is something, the Ukraine war is something very different because there are no American troops in Ukraine. So the American people had to be persuaded by the US government that what was happening in Ukraine was important to American security. So you had to skewer the story in such a way as to make it meaningful to an American audience. You can do that in a number of ways, and the way in which the Biden people chose to define it was a war of aggression. The first time this sort of war is taking place on that scale in Europe, and it could eventually come to American shores. And so did the American press give it the scope? Did it delve deeply into the complicated relationship of Russia to Ukraine? No, it did not. And so we have a war taking place almost in the abstract. And it did not bring the war home. And that was because we did not have enough American reporters there. And we didn't have enough reporters there because there were not American troops on the ground dying. When other people die, it is not necessarily a story big in the United States.
Thank you for that. This may be the last question if we're going to keep a strict time. I want to give an opportunity to Africa. And we have Peterson Wareru today in Nairobi. If you see his chat, with the current Trump-Putin standoff and the efforts to end the war, are there any parallels with the dreaminess of Reagan in his 1986 talks of disarmament? Are there any parallels there? Is it utopian, the way Putin says he's, the way Trump says he's going to approach this challenge?
I think we got to be very careful now. Trump is just into his second week back in power. He is the sort of man who talks freely, whether he's talking about a concrete proposal, whether he's talking about just a flighty idea that runs through his mind. It is extremely difficult today to make serious judgments about what it is that Trump is saying. More important, what it is Trump really intends to do. Now, he does have a way of telling you in advance what he intends to do, and in many ways, he's already started that process. He is a very difficult man to analyze because of the unpredictable nature of his thinking, but he's also easy in that if you go just with what the man says, you have pretty good insight into his mind and where he appears to be going. And at the moment, in that first week, he's ticked off dozens of ideas. Reporters, diplomats, politicians have not yet had a serious moment to go through all of them. But on a couple that he has advanced, he's already eased up. For example, he was supposed to immediately start big tariffs on the entire world. Well, that's not happening. He's doing it in a very isolated way so far. He was supposed to, on the first day, have an end to the war in Ukraine. Now he's talking about 6 months. And in that 6-month period, we'll be able to talk to Putin, and then I'll see whether he is serious about a deal. In other words, he's backed off his timetable because he hasn't yet been face to face with Putin. I suspect that will happen over the next couple of months, but it hasn't as yet. So we simply, it's early, it's the first act, and we haven't even got to the heart of the.
Right. I hope we have more time, but if not, Jack Zedkulik gets the concluding remark from our side. He points out that non-ideological authoritarian rulers fall quickly. And I'm guessing that Jack would see Putin as such a person. Um, Stalin, Khrushchev, Yeltsin, Gorbachev, they all had an ideology, but it seems as if Putin does not. And that may be a reason that history and current future events will dispatch him perhaps quicker than if he actually believed in anything.
Well, I think that Putin does believe in a vision of Russian history. And that vision of Russian history compels him to take military action, such as the war in Ukraine, such as the action he took against Georgia, such as the action he threatens to take against Moldova. There are aspects that are being played out now, part of a broad vision of a reconstituted Russian empire, in which Ukraine is sort of part of the heart of this old Russian empire. Yeltsin talked about this. Khrushchev talked about this. 19th century philosophers talked about this. There was a Slavic soul consisting of Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. And the three of them together constituted, in Putin's mind, the heart of the Russia that he wants to reconstitute. And that, to me, may not be ideology, but it is ideology transformed into a historical vision of the world. And I think that that is what drives Putin today, the reestablishment of that moment in history. And there's a dreamlike quality, but he's the dictator running Russia today, and he is setting the agenda.
Well, thank you for agreeing to spend 2 or 3 more hours with us. We can do that at a future time. We are respectful. I am respectful of you. We have some wonderful questions here, and it pains me to abandon, if you have a bit more time, we will look at those. If not, let me remind everybody that next Monday at this time, James Nixie, who is the Russia-Eurasia person at Chatham House in London, to be confirmed, by the way, but he has said that he would join us next Monday. Marvin Kalb, you were part of my upbringing and that of 2 or 3 others on this call. It's as the people say these days, it's awesome to actually get your thoughts live in this form. We thank you. We wish best success for your book. If it's #1, it's going to sell. And I ordered it 6 weeks ago. So when is it coming? I mean, I need to talk to Amazon.
Did you order it on Amazon? Just
I did. Maybe that was my mistake.
No, that is not your mistake. It is simply that the August date is simply wrong. They know it, they're correcting it. But some people, many people, are getting the book, or else it would not be #1. But I'm doing my very best to make sure that they get.
Let's see.
Thank you so much.
We will end with this thing. Marvin Kalb, thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you all.
We're very grateful.
Appreciate it. God bless you.
Thank you.